Vladimir Putin might be angling for a new ceasefire in Ukraine, but could that be just smoke? Meanwhile, the US Secretary of Defense falls off the grid, and where he pops up might surprise you. We've also gotten an eye into the extent of Chinese military corruption, and yikes, it is hilarious. These stories and a whole lot more in this extended version of the International Affairs News Roundup. Is Vladimir Putin getting cold feet? Russian President Vladimir Putin has privately expressed interest in a new ceasefire in Ukraine. According to the New York Times, Russia has been utilizing back channels and relationships with the United States to signal interest in a ceasefire. And this has been going back as far as September. The New York Times also reports that these interests will also include Russia's recognition of Ukraine's sovereignty with Kiev as its capital, but Russia will also retain the 20% of Ukraine's territory that it has taken. And all of this, of course, comes with the lines beginning to freeze along the front line and not a lot of movement happening in the war right now. All while Western aid is beginning to diminish for Ukraine, while Russia is also struggling with its own supply issues. However, it's important to remember that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has remained firm in his stance that Ukraine will not negotiate and will not surrender any of its territory. Additionally, there are concerns amongst the United States and Ukraine that this all might just be smoke and mirrors and an attempt by Putin just to regenerate strength by Russia and really not a genuine good faith effort at peace. So what, is Putin actually interested in a ceasefire, or is he just messing with us? Well, it's probably a little bit of both. It's pretty fair to say that the war has not gone exactly how Putin had originally planned, envisioned how it would go. And since the war began to expand, it's logical that he had been looking for off-ramps for a ceasefire or any kind of way for Russia to be able to get its feet back under it to continue its push. However, let's be real, it's still Vladimir Putin. It's not like he's the world's most trustworthy man. The real question is whether or not Ukraine would give Russia an off-ramp like this. And I have a hard time thinking that they will. Sure, Western aid is in a bit of an interesting position right now with the US election coming up at the end of this year and a number of other critical economic issues, not only in the United States but also throughout Europe. However, Ukraine is putting pressure on Russia, and Russia is having its own supply issues. And having said all of this, there's additional aid coming to Ukraine that deserves its own call out, because this aid is very important. However, its impact might be a little overstated. F-16s are coming to Ukraine. Ukraine is set to receive a set of F-16s from a number of NATO countries, and this should have a notable impact on Ukraine's ability to secure its airspace. However, there are some key issues here. Politico reported that the delivery of F-16s to Ukraine will be delayed by several months. Initially expected around New Year's, the first batch of F-16s from Denmark are set to arrive sometime around April of 2024 now. Denmark isn't the only country sending F-16s to Ukraine. It also includes Belgium and Norway, as well as the Netherlands. However, the delay in the aircraft being delivered is attributed to the ongoing selection and training process of Ukrainian pilots on the F-16. Ukrainian Air Force spokesperson Yuri Inat also stated that Ukraine faces a series of other issues, including infrastructure and supply issues that might make receiving the F-16s and maintaining them a little complicated at the moment. For instance, some of the pilots that are training on the F-16s are training in the United States and the United Kingdom. However, they're not expecting their training to be completed until the later end of 2024. Now, the F-16s are expected to be a large upgrade for the Ukrainian Air Force. However, U.S. officials have privately noted that these are not going to be a game-changing platform for Ukraine. And that's primarily due to the wide breadth of Russian air defenses all along the front line and the Russian Air Force still being active. Also remember that the F-16 platform is around 40 years old, and while some of its equipment and its weaponry will be upgraded, it really is still a 40-year-old platform and delivered in a quantity that's not substantial. 40 F-16s is, a lot, but it's also not 400 F-16s. However, despite these challenges, the F-16 brings a number of advantages. For instance, they not only come with an autocannon and the ability to drop bombs and shoot missiles, its agility and its ability to fight in a number of capabilities is a bit of an upgrade over Ukraine's current stockpile of Soviet-era aircraft platforms. Also, from a maintenance standpoint, it'll be easier for Ukraine to maintain the F-16 because all the NATO countries have spare parts and an infrastructural tail that will be able to maintain these aircraft, whereas with the old Soviet-era aircraft that Ukraine has previously had, those parts really had come from Russia, and they're clearly not going to be getting those anytime soon. All of this while Russia has warned that supplying F-16s to Ukraine would escalate the conflict. And I want to point out that while F-16s are not going to be a game changer for Ukraine, they are a significant landmark for Western aid to Ukraine. Consider how at the start of the war, Javelin ATGMs were considered a significant aid package to Ukraine, and they made an impact on the early phases of the war. However, at the time, things like the M1 Abrams or HIMARS or even the F-16 were considered outlandish that the West would give them to Ukraine. If not because of the logistics tail that they carry, but because of the potential escalations that carries with Russia. Now the issues with sending F-16s to Ukraine are not political, they're simply logistical, and it's not a matter of if, but when. Still though, I'd be shocked if we're about to see some version of Ukrainian Top Gun where some pilot just goes absolutely berserk and completely destroys the VKS. While Russia's Air Force is definitely nothing to sniff at, it's also nothing really compared to Western Air Forces, specifically the American one, but doctrinally they've invested heavily in air defense because they kind of figured that, yeah, they'd probably have a hard time contesting the airspace in the air, so if they can contest the airspace from the ground, then they'd be better off. And from Ukraine's standpoint, that's just going to pose a lot of challenges keeping F-16s in the air and really having an impact on the front line until they have a significant air campaign that takes out Russian air defenses. And while F-16s are a capable fighter and 40 is a good number, 40 is not enough to really change the entire war. And while the war in Ukraine rages on, there's a war in the Middle East that's also going on right now. And it's gotten a heck of a lot more chaotic. Israel is increasing its pressure on Iran, while ISIS just decided to jump from the sidelines and get involved themselves. One significant event was the killing of an IGRC commander in Syria, Syed Ghazi Musavi, who was killed by missiles whenever they struck his home outside of Damascus. And this assassination was attributed to Israel and marks the increasing tensions and increasing violence between Israel and Iran following the Hamas war. Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi declared that they would get revenge on Israel for these strikes, and Hezbollah also condemned the assassination. And in the middle of all of this, ISIS decided that they didn't want to sit this whole one out, so they also got involved and attacked Iran. In a large funeral marking the anniversary of the death of Qasem Soleimani in Tehran, a series of bombings took place, killing 84 people and injuring around 200. And full on, it makes everything in the Middle East a bit more complicated. Even if you were going to try to shoehorn the whole conflict in the Middle East to Israel versus Iran and everybody's kind of picking sides there, now what are you going to do with ISIS? Because they're decidedly anti-Israel, but they're also decidedly anti-Iran. And so now Iran's engaged in proxy wars with Israel and the United States, but also engaged in potentially an open conflict with ISIS across Iraq and Syria. And if Iran decided to deploy troops across Iraq and Syria to target ISIS, well, that just takes them a lot closer to where United States troops are operating. Yay! And to say that deconfliction between those two sides is going to be complicated, yeah, it's going to be a little awkward. And this is, of course, all while things continue to heat up on the Red Sea with the Houthis. Now, of course, you know that we're going to continue to watch this, so subscribe to this channel if you're interested in following this conflict. Now, this wasn't the only insane thing to happen since the last time that we had one of these International Affairs Roundup videos. There's been several other news stories that have happened, and this next one's just bonkers. And that's because Chinese corruption is insane, and we just learned way more about it. Recent reporting has highlighted the extent of corruption in the Chinese military, and it's pretty ugly. And it's hit the People's Liberation Army Rocket Force particularly hard. Not only did it lead to a series of inefficiencies and made parts of the force ineffective, but the report also claims that some Chinese rockets were filled with water instead of rocket fuel. These allegations, cited by Bloomberg, point to a larger issue within the Chinese military of graft and corruption, and this has become a huge headache for Xi Jinping. However, this issue is not new, it's just gained a lot more attention in recent years. And that's because high-level officials from the Chinese military have been getting fired. And that included the previous Minister of Defense, Li Shangfu, who was sacked in October of 2023 amongst the corruption scandal. And of course, as you can tell, Xi Jinping has taken this issue seriously, and he's trying to combat this level of corruption and make the PLA a more competent fighting force. Despite all these issues, experts have stated that they don't really expect these issues to have a significant impact on China's modernization abilities and its ability to fight a war, and that their goal to modernize fully by 2027 appears to be on track. However, you can't really ignore these kind of corruption scandals. Now, initially, whenever I read this report, I just kind of wanted to laugh because it's hilarious to think that whenever you're paying for rocket fuel for your nuclear deterrent, you might actually just be paying for water. But that being said, let's be real here. Here in the United States, we're paying for $1,000 hammers. So how much can we really laugh and how much can we really just kind of cry recognizing the issue? That said, there are a few things that are important to cover with this topic. First, let's consider the timing that this report is being published. We're finding out about this issue now likely because a lot of the issue has already probably been addressed within China. Not only because of the ongoing corruption purge in the Chinese military, but also because if these reports are coming from US intelligence, they're not going to just burn intelligence assets like that. They're probably only leaking this because their sources that were citing the kind of corruption that they're talking about right now have already moved on or been purged themselves. So it's no longer really a risk to report because it's not really exposing any kinds of sourcing. However, that said, that is an assumption that I'm making. Secondly, China is not the only country in the world that faces a lot of military corruption. We've talked a little bit about Russian military corruption as well and how that has impacted their ability to fight the war in Ukraine. However, that far and away is not the primary reason why they're losing. And if you look at it, really, Russia has continued to stay in the war and continue to be a lethal fighting force despite the issues. And third, with the current rate of investment in the Chinese military, really, this kind of thing will be rooted out and they'll continue to modernize at a pretty steady pace. And they're really expected to become a military force on par with the United States around 2027 anyway. And obviously that comparison with the United States, it's kind of a rough one because it's really looking at the technology and the size of the military, but not necessarily the doctrine and the structure. Like, for instance, the United States has an NCO Corps and China doesn't, which if you talk to anybody in the United States military, the NCO Corps plays a huge and important role in the military's ability to function effectively. So that China doesn't have one is a big deal. So we're not really comparing apples to apples necessarily, but from a technological standpoint, it is important to note that no, this corruption scandal is not a game ender for China. And now, again, like I said, I wanted to originally laugh at this report because it seemed pretty crazy and hilarious that was going on in China. The next day or so after the report came out, another report came out and it was just rough. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was in the hospital for around a week and nobody knew about it. And I'm not talking about nobody like you or I, normal people that don't necessarily need to know. I'm talking about nobody knowing, like the White House, the president and the chief of staff and the National Security Council. And we've had to be drip fed information about this entire ordeal ever since. So originally this all started on Friday, January 5th at 5 p.m. whenever the Pentagon told press pool reporters that Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin had been admitted to the hospital and had been there since January 1st. All they said was he'd been there. It had been due to complications of an elective procedure and that he, at that point at least, had been able to retake control of his duties. No, they did not elaborate any further, and yes, people had a lot of questions. As people began to dig, this whole story got even more ugly. While Lloyd Austin was in the hospital, his Deputy Secretary of Defense, Kathleen Hicks, was on vacation in Puerto Rico, and she assumed the duties of Secretary of Defense, but did not leave Puerto Rico because she was afraid of losing communication. In fact, it wasn't even until Thursday that the White House was informed that Lloyd Austin was in the hospital, which that is not a great sign. People continued to dig and they found out that Lloyd Austin had been admitted to the hospital originally for surgery on December 22nd, and come to find out that was for pancreatic cancer. However, after his surgery on the 22nd, his surgery had an infection, and so he had to go back to the hospital on January 1st, where he was admitted to the ICU and was unable to do his duties. So it was around January 1st that duties were passed to Kathleen Hicks, and nobody was told about it in the White House. In fact, there was a report of a meeting with the National Security Council in the White House on Tuesday that he was supposed to be at, but clearly he wasn't there because he had other things going on. And even President Biden was curious where he was, but nobody knew where he was. Nobody told anybody. And it's not like this is all happening on just a normal, first week of the year. There are crises going on in the world that we've already talked about in this video. There are U.S. troops receiving contact in the Middle East from Iran. This is pretty rough. So after all of this became public, Lloyd Austin released a statement basically saying, "My bad, bro," and proceeded to just move on with his life. And look, I think that we should all be happy that he's at least doing better now. Look, cancer sucks, and it sucks that he got diagnosed with that, and infections from surgery sucks, and that's all scary. So it's good that he's at least recovering now. And he should know this, he was a 4-star general. Personal accountability is a huge part of the equation. If you're going to go somewhere, somebody else needs to know. When Kathleen Hicks assumed the duties of Secretary of Defense Defense while he was in the hospital, she didn't know why. She was just told he wasn't able to perform the duties. Here, tag, you're it. Guys, that's just not supposed to work like that. And no, because I know some people on the internet are going to take this the weird way. This isn't part of some kind of ulterior motive or some sort of conspiracy. I personally, I think that this is just general human complacency and just a complete mess up, which it's not like we're in a complete era of peace right now. We can't be having these kinds of slip-ups. However, I'm glad at least we're not in the middle of a full-scale war, because these slip-ups can be hugely problematic. And I say that we're not in the middle of a full-scale war, but we might be eyeing one in the future because of this next story. It's about to get really tense between China and Taiwan. On January 18th, people in Taiwan will hit the polls for their next general election, and the stakes could not be higher. There are three main candidates for the Taiwanese election, and each kind of present different angles for how not only to deal with China, but to deal with issues of national defense and to deal with the United States. First, you have William Lai Cheng-te with the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP. Now, this is the current incumbent vice president to the sitting president, Tsai Ing-wen. However, she's done with her presidency. She's already had her 2 terms, so she can't run for re-election. So Lai Cheng-te is expected to be basically a continuation of the same policies from the previous administration. And basically that is to say that the DPP recognizes that Taiwan is its own independent state and that they will seek a dialogue with China. However, they will also seek a closer relationship with the United States and will also seek to bolster national defense. On kind of the other side of the aisle, if you can call that, you have Ho Yu-yi, or with the Kuomintang or the KMT. Now, Ho is seen as a more Beijing-friendly candidate. He advocates for cross-strait dialogue with China. However, he's also into bolstering Taiwan's military capacity. And of course, aside from those two, you have a third candidate, Ko Wen-je, with the TPP, or the Taiwan People's Party. And Ko is basically presenting himself as a third option, where basically he's branded himself as the DPP being a vote for war and the KMT being a vote for capitulation. So a vote for the TPP is basically a vote for in between, where they're going to try to not go to war, but they're also not going to concede to China. Now, this election is going to have significant impacts on cross-strait relations in Taiwan and China. A victory for Lai would, of course, mean the continuing policies that have existed already. However, China is not a fan of the DPP. They see the DPP as basically reinforcing a rogue Taiwan, and they want to see the DPP ejected from power. Ho, of course, wants closer relations with China. So as you can imagine, China is clearly angling for a victory for the Kuomintang. This election could define the course of 2024 and later years, because China has already, of course, set the goal for Taiwan to be reunified by 2027. They've talked about military readiness by 2027. It appears to be a very big year. However, Xi Jinping has increased his rhetoric around Taiwan, including a message about Taiwan in his New Year's address. And with 2024 being the year of the dragon, it's really kind of a tense year coming up for Taiwan. And we've already talked about all of this in my last video talking about the flashpoints for 2024. So if you're interested in that, check that out. Finally, just whenever you thought that there wasn't enough chaos in 2024, Ecuador decided, hey, you know what? We want in. And of course, this kicked off with the leader of the criminal group Los Chaneros, Adolfo Mesias, escaping from prison. Following his escape, violence broke out in a series of 6 prisons, with over 150 guards and staff being taken hostage. There was also a series of bombings taking place in a series of villages, as well as a TV station being taken over by a criminal gang. However, this was only the beginning of the crisis. President Daniel Noboa, the youngest president in Ecuador's history, declared a state of internal armed conflict against the gangs and mobilized the police, the gendarmerie, and the military against these gangs. The head of the armed forces re-emphasized this point, stating that there would be no negotiations. So why is this all happening right now? Well, crime has become an increasing issue in Ecuador, with it becoming increasingly visited by Colombian and Mexican cartels. In 2023, over 8,000 people were killed from violent crime, which was nearly double from 2022. The murder rate has also quadrupled from 2018 to 2022. With the rising rate of violence, the inclusion of different cartel groups, as well as violence in prisons and villages, it was really time for the government to act. It doesn't help at all that the country's economy has struggled post-COVID, but violence of this sort is not really going to help a growing economy anyway. So it was clearly time for Ecuador to batten down the hatches and take care of the situation. And this move is not unpopular. People are pretty thrilled. They're happy that, the government is taking a firmer stance. And for the United States, this will likely continue to impact things like illegal immigration, with large amounts of people fleeing from these kinds of areas towards the United States in hope of safety and a better economic future. In fact, you could reasonably reasonably refer to these kinds of people as refugees. That said, it's refreshing to see a government taking this kind of issue seriously and doing what needs to be done, no matter how uncomfortable or how bad it could get. But that said, what are your thoughts on this? And what are your thoughts on any of the other stories that we've talked about in this video? Comment those thoughts down below. I'd love to keep the conversation going. Like this video if you thought it was helpful or informative, and I will see you all next time.